Well, thank you very much. And I'm here to talk about one of the aspects of my book, The New Serfdom, which talks about the baleful effects of the economic guru Friedrich Hayek and the fact that Mrs. Thatcher thought everything he said was rather good and put quite a lot of it into effect, along with Ronald Reagan, creating what I call a world that's really shaped by the ideas of market fundamentalism, that markets should actually get to make most of the decisions in all and every aspect of our existence, and that the market encroaches further and further and further into that decision-making process. And the last thing that you should actually want to see happen in any civilized society is that the state or the democratic collective expressed through the state should maybe have some opinions about how things ought to be provided, what should be available, that aren't necessarily connected to market mechanisms. And so this book is about that. There are aspects of that I want to particularly address today in the talk, which is entitled Work Doesn't Pay. And it's about the paradox of what's been happening in our labour market for the last 40 years and where we have ended up now. I want to talk about some of the basic shapes and structures around that market, but I also want you all to bear in mind the fact that as well as the influence of deregulation and market fundamentalism on our labour market, it is now being assailed by a period of some of the largest change we're ever likely to see in our lifetimes, which is the impact of the fourth industrial revolution, the digital revolution, and what's actually happening with that, which is another issue presenting us with huge challenges for the future, which will complicate how we try to respond and use the benefits of these new technologies to help everybody rather than just enrich a few people. And I think just in passing on that, whenever you have huge technological change, forces are created which tend to enrich a few people very much indeed and create such change and disruption for others that they become impoverished. We've seen it in all our industrial revolutions. But I think that if we assert ourselves as a democracy and as a state and as a polity, as a people, as a society, we can actually make sure that we ensure that the benefits of these changes and disruptions that are coming our way very, very rapidly and at an increasing rate can actually be shared more widely, and that we can get through this time of disjunction with a lot more fairness and equity than we would in the absence of that kind of ambition to manage it. So let's go back to the paradox of our labour market, because whenever our current government, and I'm not being party political, obviously, you wouldn't expect me to be that way at an event like this, whenever it wants to boast about something, it boasts about how fantastically successful the labour market is. And it always talks in quantitative terms about how many jobs have been created, how we have the largest number of people in employment ever in our history, partially because our population's increased, but that's another issue. And large amounts of new jobs are being created. It's all very dynamic and wonderful. But at the same time, the satisfaction levels for some employees are so high, and there's job satisfaction, and yet at the same time and alongside them, others are struggling to make ends meet, and they're never being able to escape in-work poverty and insecurity. So we've got this paradox going on, which you can resolve, I think, if you look behind some of the headline figures about quantity and start looking about quality of the sorts of jobs that are on offer. So we have to consider what is happening to quality in the job market rather than just thinking about numbers of jobs. And taking this perspective, it actually becomes clear that there's an increasing segmentation in our labour market into what have been characterised as lovely and lousy jobs. And if you're in the lovely sector, you've got your own pension, you know what your hours are, you're probably progressing, you know that you can be promoted, you're shoring up your pension, you've got holiday pay and sick pay, time off, agency at work, and all of those things. And you're having a great time, and it's very fulfilling. You feel as a human being that you're helping provide a service in a collective way, whatever it is you're doing, and you're enjoying your job. That's the lovely end. And then at the lousy end, this is very, very different. The lousy end tends to be jobs which are on minimum wage. It tends to be jobs where the hours aren't guaranteed and can go down as well as up. Also, quite often where there's a great deal of insecurity and a genuine no knowledge whatsoever about the hours that you'll be guaranteed in the future, but your costs stay the same. Quite often it might be a 0 hours contract, it might be a part-time work contract or an agency contract, and so you can't guarantee your hours going forwards, and yet your outgoings are all too predictably the same. At the same time, the pay rises aren't happening, and your pay has probably been stagnant for at least 10 years, and you're not getting real terms pay increases. But at the same time, if you're in the private rented sector, rents are going up, costs are going up, the cost of your utilities are going up. So you are actually in a situation where you're working, but you're not making any progress, and you can't actually see an end to that kind of treadmill that you're on. Employers quite often won't say they're employers, and they'll make you contract separately. And if you do that, if you become apparently self-employed or you incorporate, that can be a good choice if you're a freelancer who can command a huge price, but all too often it's done as a sort of scam to ensure that your employer doesn't have to take on the cost of sick pay, pay national insurance, give you holiday pay, or have any responsibilities towards you if circumstances change. So we're now in a modern economy which is shaped by the forces of market fundamentalism, which were unleashed by Mrs. Thatcher. And we've got this segmented labour market, which is increasingly segmented between lovely and lousy jobs. And 1 in 8 of those at work now are classified as poor. So this is not a small number of people at the margins. This is actually 1 in 8 of those at work. So they work, but work doesn't really pay. And there's little progression. You can't progress from a job in the lousy sector to a job in the lovely sector. The two are segmented away. And if you're in one, it's very difficult to get out of the lousy sector into a different sort of sector. Research shows that 5 out of 6 people who find themselves in in-work poverty cannot get out of it within a 10-year period. So they are facing a kind of treadmill where there's no obvious way out, that they can't work their way out or promote their way out or do anything like that. They're just stuck. In the last 25 years, what's happened is that poverty in work, those who are work but are still poor, has risen from 5% of the working population now to 18%. So it's an increasing feature. And I think that in the absence of government regulation or action to regulate employer abuses, redefine what employment might mean, ensure that employers who are trying to get out of their responsibilities to workers are actually have the law enforced, it's very difficult to see this getting any better. And we know that Frederick Hayek and famously Mrs. Thatcher loathed trade unions, and they legislated against the effectiveness of trade unions because they saw them as a way that those who work for a living and who labour could actually make a reasonable amount of reward from those who are owners of capital. And we've seen ever since that happened in the Trade Union Acts in the 1980s The number of people in trade unions has fallen. So in the private sector, it's now less than 15% of workers in a trade union. And it's under 50% in the public sector as well. So now increasingly people's wages aren't decided by collective bargaining or collective action. They're decided in one-to-one relations with an employer, or they are just pronounced upon, and the employee likes it or lumps it. So insecurity, precariousness, lack of employment protections, all of them in their own way suppress wages. It makes it very hard for an individual to decide that they want to bargain for their wage if they think they might just, if they're a part-timer or an agency worker, and if they make a fuss, then they just won't be asked back. And then they'll get a reputation for being a troublemaker, so they'll never get to work again. So they have to knuckle under and work often longer hours in more intensive ways for real earnings which are less than they were 10 years ago. And of course, the economic aspects of that, the macroeconomic aspects, are that if...
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.